Growth is not just becoming more. It is also leaving something behind. Consider what you have left behind to become who you are today. The fears you outgrew. The versions of yourself you quietly buried. The languages your younger body spoke that your older one has forgotten. Every year added to a life is also a year subtracted from something else. From softness, from wonder, from the particular innocence that only ignorance can protect. This is not a loss. This is the contract. There is an old saying in the village where this story was born, a saying so old that no one living remembers who first spoke it, only that it has always been true. The river that refuses to flow does not become a lake. It becomes a wound in the earth. What happens, then, to a child who refuses to move through time? What happens to the water that will not flow? This is that story. And I must warn you now, before we begin, there is no monster in this tale. There is no villain, no curse, no spirit that arrives in the night bearing malice. There is only one child. A child who stayed. And the slow, quiet catastrophe of a world that could not stay with them. The village of Owuraib sat between two hills the way a sleeping man rests between two pillows, unhurried, settled, at ease with its own smallness. It was not a village that appeared on any map that mattered. It had no market famous enough for outsiders to travel toward it, no river deep enough for boats, no mineral in its red earth valuable enough for extraction. What it had was what all quiet places have, rhythm. The rhythm of planting and harvest. Of dry season dust and wet season mud. Of births announced by ululation at dawn and deaths mourned by drumming at dusk. The rhythm of ordinary life, which is the most sacred rhythm there is, and the most easily broken. It was into this rhythm that Adeez was born. Her name meant daughter of the king, though her family had no king's blood, only a grandmother who had believed, in the particular way grandmothers believe things, that certain children arrive already carrying their own crowns. She was 7 years old when this story truly begins, though she had already been remarkable for all 7 of those years in the small ways that remarkable children are remarkable. She laughed easily and often, she shared her food without being asked, she remembered the names of everyone's grandparents and inquired after their health with a sincerity that made adults feel seen. She was the kind of child who made a village feel lucky. Her mother, Nkechi, was a woman built for endurance. Wide shoulders, calloused hands, a laugh that came from deep in the belly and arrived everywhere at once. She carried Adeez on her back long after most mothers had put their children down, not from weakness, but from a tenderness she did not know how to speak, and so expressed instead through proximity. When Adeez was old enough to walk beside her to the stream, they walked in comfortable silence. And the silence between them was the kind that only forms between people who have long since stopped needing words to feel understood. Her father, Chukwabuka, was quieter, a man who repaired things, shoes, fences, broken handles on hose, collapsed sections of roof. There was something in his character that mirrored his work. He did not argue, he fixed. When tension entered the household, he did not raise his voice. He found the source of the breakage and attended to it with steady hands. He loved Adeez the way a man loves something he is afraid of losing before he has fully understood it. In the evenings, when the cooking fire threw amber light across the compound wall, Adeez would sit between her parents and listen to the elder women tell stories. She did not fidget or demand attention. She listened with her whole body, leaning slightly forward, as though the stories were warm and she was cold. She asked questions that made the elderly women exchange glances, not because the questions were inappropriate, but because they were too precise. She listens like she already knows the ending. At the time, it was a compliment. At the time. It is difficult to say exactly when anyone first noticed. That is the nature of things that happen slowly. They do not arrive with announcement. They accumulate, the way dust accumulates on a surface in a room you stop entering, imperceptible day by day, undeniable when finally you look directly at it. Adeez was 7 when the dry season came that year. She was 7 when the rains returned. She was 7 when the harvest was brought in, when the new planting began, when the dry season came again. She was 7 the following year. And the year after that. The children she had played with in the compound began, in the gradual way of children, to lengthen. Their limbs stretched. Their faces thinned and sharpened into something less soft, less perfectly round. Obi, who had once been shorter than Adeez, now looked down at her when they spoke. Chisholm, her closest companion, began wrapping her hair and speaking about the coming of womanhood with a self-conscious pride that Adeez observed but did not share. Did not approach. Could not approach. Because Adeez remained 7. Not approximately 7. Not 7 in the way we sometimes say a child looks young for their age. 7 with a precision that began to unsettle people once they allowed themselves to see it. The same height. The same face. The same small hands that had always been small. The same gap in her upper teeth that all the other children had long since grown past. Nkechi, her mother, was the last to name it. This is not surprising. It is the particular labor of loving something deeply. It makes you the last to see clearly what others see easily. She had explained the stillness to herself in a dozen quiet ways before the explanations ran out. It was a neighbor, a woman named Oge, pragmatic and unsentimental, the kind of woman villages quietly depend on for unvarnished truth, who finally said what everyone had been rotating around. Your daughter has not grown. Not in 3 years. You know this. Nkechi looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at Adeez, who was sitting in the doorway of the compound, stripping leaves from a branch with calm, methodical fingers, her small profile unchanged, her posture unchanged, her presence in that doorway exactly as it had always been. I know, Nkechi said. And the knowing, once spoken, could not be put back. What communities do with the inexplicable is one of the great, under-examined facts of human life. When something cannot be explained, it is usually one of 2 things, destroyed or elevated. Owuraib, which was a village of fundamentally kind instincts, chose elevation. The word miracle entered the conversation quietly at first, a whisper here, a suggestion there, then solidified into common use the way words do when they answer a need. Adeez was a miracle child. Adeez had been chosen. Her preservation from the usual changes of time was evidence of that protection. The interpretation carried the community's anxiety and transformed it into pride. The elder women burned incense near her doorway. The herbalist, a man named Obichina, old enough to have watched 2 generations of the village pass through his compound, came and observed her and said nothing for a long time, and what he said when he finally spoke was this. Be careful what you name a thing. Names have weight. And weight, held long enough, becomes its own kind of problem. Nobody wrote it down. Most people moved past it quickly. Adeez was given small privileges. She was seated near the front at ceremonies. Young mothers brought their newborns to touch her, believing something of her preservation might transfer. Her opinions were solicited in matters of minor village importance in a way that a child's opinions would not ordinarily be solicited, partly because she was considered special, and partly, though no one said this directly, because her opinions were always unusually sound. She accepted these attentions with a patience that should, perhaps, have been its own kind of signal. A child of 7 who is seated at the front of the ceremonies and consulted by adults typically responds with giddy excitement or anxious confusion. Adeez responded with neither. She responded with a stillness that matched her body's stillness, composed, watchful, somehow already accounted for. Obi and Chisholm and the other children of her original age group moved further from her world as the years accumulated. Not out of cruelty. Children are rarely cruel in premeditated ways, but out of the natural drift that occurs between people whose experiences have diverged completely. She watched them go with an expression that those who caught it described differently. Her mother said it was acceptance. Obi China, the herbalist, who watched from a greater distance, said it was something closer to grief. That it was the expression of someone watching a departing boat from a shore they cannot leave. By what the village reckoned to be the 5th year of Adeez's stillness, she remained 7, unchanging, while the world around her aged at its ordinary pace. The conversations had quietly changed in nature. It began with small things. A woman arguing with her husband about a land boundary came to describe the situation to Adeez in passing, not for advice, but out of habit. Adeez listened and then said, simply and without drama, "The issue is not the land. He is afraid you do not need him anymore. Resolve that fear, and the land will follow." The woman stood still for a moment. Then she went home. The argument was resolved within 3 days. The incident was recounted and marveled at. It became part of the growing collection of Adeez's perceptions, catalogued and shared in the way villages catalog and share remarkable things. But beneath the marvel, in people who paid close attention, something small and cold had taken root. Because the land boundary observation was not something a child would say. Not in its structure, not in its emotional architecture, not in the particular way it named the invisible thing beneath the visible problem. It was the observation of someone who had watched many arguments, who had developed over time the capacity to see through surfaces to the thing underneath. She began to speak at greater length. Not performatively, she was never theatrical, never sought attention. But when she spoke, people stopped what they were doing. Her sentences arrived whole and unhurried. She used proverbs correctly. Not in the way children use proverbs, repeating them imprecisely, proud of the adult sound, but in the way elders use them, placed exactly, at exactly the right moment, to land with exactly the right weight. She described her dreams to her mother one morning. The dreams were not childish. They were layered, recursive, dreams full of the kind of symbolic density that belongs to long lives, lives that have accumulated enough material for the sleeping mind to arrange into complex architecture. She dreamed of things she had never seen. Nkechi. Obi Akina's response was quiet and devastating in its simplicity. A child of 7 should not know that kind of tired. Nkechi pressed her lips together. Then, in the silence, "She is not 7. The admission, which she had been approaching for years, arrived in her mouth like something she had been carrying a long way and could no longer hold. It is one thing to be unusual. It is another to be uncanny. Unusual is the distance. Uncanny is something closer. It is the wrong thing in the right frame, the familiar detail in an unfamiliar arrangement. It is your own face in a mirror, slightly off. It is a lullaby played in the wrong key." Adeez became uncanny. The children who had grown up beside her, Obi, now a broad-shouldered young man learning his father's trade, Chisholm, now a young woman spoken for in the quiet early conversations of marriage, could not be near her without a discomfort they did not know how to name. The eyes said, "A child." The presence said something much longer. She finished sentences. Not occasionally. Not in the way bright children sometimes predict the direction of a thought and race ahead. She finished sentences that had no predictable direction, sentences that changed course mid-delivery, that no one could reasonably have anticipated. And she finished them correctly, with the word or phrase that the speaker had been feeling toward without knowing it themselves. Grown men became uncomfortable being observed by her. There is a particular experience, known to anyone who has been truly seen, not just looked at, of awareness under genuine perception. It is both desirable and deeply exposing. Adeez's gaze carried it, and her gaze lived in a child's face, which made it unbearable in a way that was hard to articulate and harder still to confess. She looked at me, and I felt as though she knew every argument I had had with my father before he died. Every one of them. Obi China, the herbalist, began to visit the compound more frequently. He brought no remedies. He brought no rituals. He brought only his presence and his attention, and he sat with Adeez in the compound and watched her with the particular watchfulness of someone who has identified a pattern they are not yet ready to name. One afternoon, she turned to him and said, "You have been trying to understand me for a long time now." "Yes," he said. "You are close. But you are still thinking about it as something that happened to me. You have not yet thought about what is happening inside me." He was quiet for a very long time before he asked, "What is happening inside you?" She looked at the sky, and then she said, "Have you ever tried to hold water in your hand? Not a vessel. Your hand." He nodded slowly. "It is like that. Except the water is years." Obi China did not sleep for 3 nights after that conversation. On the 4th night, he went to the baobab tree at the edge of the village. The old one, the one older than the memory of anyone living, whose hollow had been used for generations to store sacred objects and difficult truths, and he sat with his back against its vast trunk and stayed there until the sky changed color. Those who saw him go said he left with one face and returned with another. Not older, exactly. Heavier. He went to Nkechi the following morning. What he told her, what he had spent 4 days assembling from the pieces of what he had observed and heard and felt, was this. Time had not stopped for Adeez. Time was never capable of stopping. Time was not the kind of force that accommodated exceptions. What had stopped was the release. In every living thing, growth serves 2 purposes simultaneously. It adds, and it transforms. When a child grows, they do not simply become larger, they are changed by the addition. The child who is 7 cannot fully coexist with the child who is 12, because the 12-year-old is the 7-year-old's transformation, not their continuation. Growing is a constant process of dying into your next self. It requires surrender. It requires leaving behind. Adeez's body had stopped surrendering. It had locked. And everything that should have been passing through her was staying, pressing in, building. Her body was the size of 7. But what was inside her body was no longer 7. It had not been 7 for a long time. How long? Nkechi asked. I cannot say. But consider this. She speaks the way I speak. With the weight I carry. I have lived 63 years. I do not know how many she carries, but I hear it in her. I hear it the way you hear a drum in a crowded room, not because it is the loudest sound, but because it is the deepest. Obi China. Nkechi pressed her hands flat against the table between them, as though steadying herself on the physical world. Is she suffering? She asked. Obi China considered this with the care it deserved. She is not in pain the way pain is understood. But she is compressed. She is a vessel that was made for flow and has been made to hold. And nothing that was made for flow is at peace when it holds. The rains came 3 more times. Adeez remained. But the world around her, which had once accommodated her, bent itself gently to the shape of her presence, began to resist. Not in dramatic ways. The resistance was quiet, interpersonal, atmospheric. The kind of resistance that happens when something refuses to belong to its context and the context, eventually, stops trying to include it. The young mothers who had once brought their newborns to her stopped coming. Not because they decided not to, but because they would prepare to come, would lift their children, would begin walking toward the compound, and would find themselves slowing, stopping, turning back without being fully able to explain why. Some instinct, not fear of Adeez, but something older and more wordless than named fear, redirected them. The ceremonies where she had been given an honored placement began finding reasons to seat her differently. Not in disgrace. Not noticeably. But she moved, over seasons, from center to edge. From visible to present but peripheral. The community was adjusting the way communities adjust to things that no longer fit the frame. Not by confrontation, but by gentle, collective reconfiguration. Adeez knew. She said nothing about knowing, but she knew. She sat, more and more, alone. Not dramatically alone, not cast out, not rejected. But alone in the specific way of someone who has become incomprehensible to those around them. Alone the way you are alone in a conversation conducted in a language only you fully speak. Nkechi watched her daughter sit in the doorway of their compound in the evenings. The same doorway, the same posture, the same small silhouette she had always been, and felt a grief she had no name for. She asked Adeez once, in the quiet way she had always asked her things, "Are you lonely?" Adeez was quiet for a long time. "I am not lonely. But I am alone in a way that has nothing to do with people. I am alone in time. Everyone around me moves through it. Even you. And I watch you move through it, and I can see where you are going, and I cannot follow." "Where are we going?" Nkechi asked, and she was not sure if she was asking as a mother or as something smaller, something more frightened. "Forward." Simply. As though the word contained everything. It was in the 8th year of Adeez's stillness. If stillness was the right word, if stillness had ever been the right word, that it began. The first sign was the mirrors. The compound had one mirror, metal-backed, hung on the interior wall of the main room. Adeez had not looked at it directly in years. Not out of vanity or avoidance, or perhaps precisely out of avoidance without naming it that, but because mirrors had become, for her, a particular kind of cruelty. They confirmed what she already knew and could not change, the gap between reflection and interior. But one morning, Nkechi walked into the room and found Adeez standing before the mirror. Standing very close to it. Her small hands were at her sides. Her face. Nkechi could not adequately describe the expression. She described it to Obi China later as reading. As though Adeez was reading the mirror's surface the way you read a difficult text, carefully, without expression, letting the meaning arrive in its own time. When Adeez became aware of her mother behind her, she turned. "Something is changing." "In the mirror?" Nkechi asked. "In me." It happened over the course of 23 days. Later, those who had been present could not agree on whether they had seen it or felt it, whether the change had been visible or only sensed. But the consensus was this: Adeez began to age. Not at the pace of ordinary aging. The process was not human in its tempo. It moved the way water moves when a vessel that has been sealed finally opens. Not violently, but with the particular urgency of pressure long restrained. On the morning of the 23rd day, the village woke to a sound. Not a scream. Not a cry. Something quieter and more final. A single low note, the kind of sound that a large thing makes when it settles. The kind of sound a tree makes in the moment it comes to rest. When Nkechi came into the room, the bed was empty. Not empty of Adeez. Adeez was there. But something else that had been in the room was gone. Something that had taken up space in the air, in the light, in the particular weight of the atmosphere, was gone. Released. Adeez lay in the bed, and she was not 7. She was thin, in the way of someone who has traveled a very long way. She was quiet, in the way of someone who has finally, after a long time of waiting, stopped. She opened her eyes and looked at her mother. And Kechi, who was not a woman who wept easily, wept. "Are you still in there?" Kechi asked. "Most of me," Adeez said. Her voice was different. Not frightening. Not wrong. Only different, the way a river sounds different at its end than at its beginning, though it is the same water. She slept for a long time after that. No one left the compound. Time passed. Adeez recovered. Slowly. Not in the way of recovering from illness, but in the way of recovering from great exertion, from something that required more than a body has to give and took from other reserves, deeper and less replenishable. She walked again by the end of the dry season. She sat outside in the compound, in the afternoon light, and let the sun be on her face with the gratitude of someone who had not been sure they would feel sun again. Owuraib changed. Not loudly. Not in the visible ways of change. The buildings remained, the river path remained, the baobab tree remained. But in the understanding that runs beneath the surface of a community, in the shared vocabulary of belief, in the unspoken agreements about what to celebrate and what to be careful about, something had shifted. The mothers stopped praying for their children to be exempt from time. In the prayers at birth, the ones whispered over newborns in the early morning before anyone else is awake, the line that had once said, "May this child be preserved, may change not touch them," was quietly removed, replaced with something harder and truer. May this child move through time with grace. May they be strong enough to leave what must be left behind. Obi China, in his last year of life, which came 2 seasons after Adeez's resolution, as if he had been waiting, as if his particular task in this story had needed to be completed before he could depart, told the story to anyone who would sit still long enough to receive it. We thought we were witnessing grace. We were witnessing accumulation. And accumulation without transformation is not abundance. It is weight. And weight, when it finally moves, moves all at once. He paused. The fire between him and his listeners made his face look ancient, which it was. The frightening thing was not the child. The frightening thing was how long it took us to understand that what we were celebrating was not a blessing. It was a warning. Here is what the village of Owuraib learned, and what I offer to you now, from the distance of a story. Growth is not comfortable. It was never meant to be. To grow is to submit to change, and to submit to change is to acknowledge that who you are today is not the final version, not the permanent version, not the version that deserves to be locked in place and preserved against all further movement. It is to accept, again and again, the quiet grief of leaving youth, leaving certainty, leaving the person you were in the seasons before this one. This is not a loss. This is the contract. And when something refuses the contract, when by miracle or by wound or by the particular stubbornness of the human spirit, the growth stops while the life continues, it does not create stillness. It creates pressure. It creates the slow accumulation of everything that was meant to flow and was made instead to hold. Adeez was not a monster. She was not cursed, not punished, not the victim of a malevolent spirit. She was a child who could not leave herself behind, and that particular impossibility was its own kind of suffering. None of us can fully remain who we were. This is not the tragedy it sometimes feels like. It is the architecture of a life. Each version of us is the doorway to the next, and the door can only be passed through by releasing the grip. The river that refuses to flow does not become a lake. It becomes a wound in the earth. And so, may you grow. May you move. May you be changed by the years you are given, changed fully and without resistance, knowing that what you leave behind was real, was good, was necessary to carry you here, and knowing also that carrying it forever would have made the next step impossible. May you have the courage to leave, and the grace to know that leaving is not loss. They say in Owuraib to this day that when children run in the compound, and their parents call them inside for the evening, the children come without being asked twice. Not out of obedience, but because someone, once, stood still while the evening moved without her. And the memory of that stillness is enough to make even the youngest child understand, time is not waiting. And it is better, always better, to move with it.